Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for starting your weekend with us. It's Friday night, and if you are going to watch this later, you can just think back to the fact that we're all here on Friday night. Some of us, including me, with a drink in hand, yay, saluting our authors, who are all published by Crooked Lane Books, and we're delighted to have you here. I never get the word out that our events are BYOB. Oh, good, almost everybody had it. But anyway, the missing author from our quintet, I'm sad to say, is Emery Hayes. So I'm holding up her book. It's called Back from the Brink, and I believe it is the second book about a Blue Mesa, Montana sheriff whose name is Nicole Cobain. And there's a lot of action in this book, and the characters are interesting. It's a little bit like another of your fellow authors, Margaret Mizushima, whom you may know from Crooked Lane Books, and she has a relationship between the canine dog handler and the local veterinarian that's not totally different than the relationship that's developing between Nicole Cobain, sheriff, and the medical examiner. But one of the reasons to read this book is the landscape is terrific, and it's very much a character in the book, and the action plays out against it. It's very close to the Canadian border. So at the end of the book, we actually have the Royal Canadian Mounted Police kind of doing some sort of cool stuff in the background. And so if you're a fan of C.J. Box and Craig Johnson and other people who write about this part of the West End, new author Connor Sullivan, who's the son of Mark Sullivan, has a terrific book out that is set in Montana, which is also almost like a genre of thrillers, Montana thrillers being a genre. But let's talk about now to the authors that are actually with us. And the first one is Kris Calvin. And look at this lovely book. It's called All That Fall. And I have to say, Kris, I thought this was an extremely complicated plot with a lot of characters. So why don't you introduce yourself to us in terms of your background and whatever, and then we'll come back after we circle around and talk about the book itself.
Of course. So I've been in policy and sort of politics adjacent for a long time in Sacramento, which is the capital of California. And so my background is in psychology, economics, forensic psychology. And I did not grow up wanting to be a writer. I never did any creative writing. I just did a lot of analytical writing, and that may be sort of what you're speaking to, lots of pieces that come together. So I don't know how much, that's probably enough, and it's nice to see you all and to be here with you.
Well, it's nice to have you. I went to Stanford, but it was so back in the dark ages, like 1958,
oh no, me too.
That I'm an old person, so it's kind of fun to think about California in 1958 when it was very formal, and my mother wore gloves to go up into San Francisco, and we wouldn't have occurred to us to go out without wearing stockings and heels to any event. And that was 5 years before Haight-Ashbury, and then the whole thing changed dramatically. But Sacramento is not San Francisco. It's a really interesting city, lots of craft breweries in Sacramento. And of course, Folsom Prison, where I have actually spent time touring and been in the execution chamber, not something I would recommend. But I was very interested in a statement, Kris, you make in the acknowledgments of your book. I did not feel safe in my home as a child, and I'm not alone in that. And perhaps that's something that we should develop when we come back to talking about your book, because I think that you must have drawn on that in order to write this book. Would that be true?
Yes, and I'd be happy to speak to that. It actually does drive. This is the first in a series, and I'm finishing the second now, and I'm very much aware of how it influences what I write and how I write. So I'd be happy to after I hear other folks.
Yeah, I don't want to make it so personal that it would embarrass you, but I think since you made a point of saying it, that, you know, in the book itself, that it might be worth.
I would actually be happiest to talk about that. I think it's the one thing I'll say now is what it's led me to is to make adventure stories where children don't come to harm. And there's actually a spoiler alert on my website and everywhere else that even though this has a kidnap plot with a child, you know the child will be safe if you read anything by me. So it's led me to try to write stories that are so exciting that you're on the edge of your seat, but not where you stay up all night worrying for a child. So it's very much how I write and what I write. And it's probably a little bit different than a lot of thrillers.
It's so interesting how writers are shaped by their various life experiences. So that'll be a wonderful topic to come back to. So Matt Mixa, who is our next author, 13 Days to Die, which already gives you an idea that the structure of the book may possibly be related to counting down the days. Would that be a fair thing to say, Matt?
Yes, for sure, for sure. And just a little bit about my background. So I studied Chinese politics and Chinese foreign policy at Columbia University. Had the opportunity to do some field research in Beijing during the 2008 Olympics, which was such a moment for that country. Just thinking about it kind of emerging in that very public, very splashy way. So I was able to do a little bit of research there to understand how was that event shaping what was happening in the country at the time. And then after graduating from graduate school, I sort of accidentally fell into the world of intelligence, was drafted into the FBI. So I worked as an FBI counterintelligence analyst out of the Chicago division. So I would work foreign threats like China, Russia, using my language skills, kind of applying some of the things that I had learned academically. And, that just got my brain thinking about what threats are really the, most poignant to the United States, and thinking about some of these, major actors in the world like China and Russia, and just that kind of thriller brain that I'm sure folks on this session all know, where you just start to play out scenarios and think about the sort of worst case scenarios, and putting that on the page.
Bad actor is what he actually means from the US perspective, although from their own perspective, not. Daniel Silva's new book, The Cellist, which was out in July, when we had a conversation with Daniel, very much looks at Russia as we're back on a Cold War from his point of view. And certainly Brad Thor's book in July was looking very much at China expanding into Norway. But I find it interesting that you're an FBI intelligence analyst. I know former CIA intelligence analysts who have become novelists. Alma Katsu would be one, Francine Matthews would be another, but I don't think I run into an FBI intelligence analyst. So how do you see the difference between the FBI and the CIA in terms of intelligence?
Yeah, so I think one of the interesting parts about the counterintelligence mission from an FBI perspective is it's really focused on thwarting and disrupting the activities of foreign spies within our country. So whereas the CIA is going to operate overseas and agents are going to collect intelligence in, potentially, denied enemy territory, you're still going to have agents running around in Moscow and Beijing trying to recruit sources and collect intelligence. The FBI here is really focused on all of the folks from those foreign intelligence services who are getting into some tricky business here on our home front. So, in that role, I used to tell people just to boil it down, my job was spy hunting and mole hunting, because you always have to look for people within the FBI or the intelligence community who have been turned by foreign intelligence officers to, share secrets with foreign countries. So it makes you really popular at the Christmas party when you are in the group responsible for being suspicious of everyone all the time. But, I found that degree of hyper suspicion and really the chess game between the intelligence services, who will go to just extreme lengths to try to deceive one another through very elaborate means, to be such a fascinating subject for writing thrillers, because you can get into just all of the tricky ways that characters in these different organizations are trying to outsmart each other and get one step ahead of one another. It's not all car chases and shootouts. Sometimes it's the dead drops and the secret codes and the sneaky back alley type work of the spies that I find really interesting.
That's real life cat and mouse game. So basically what you're saying, it's like MI5 and MI6, in that the FBI and MI5 look into the US and into Britain, and MI6 and the CIA are looking outward. And, I just wanted to confirm that were true. So Emilya, your book is called Hide in Place. And I thought one of the most interesting aspects of this book is your depiction of Alfie, this child. But why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself before we talk about your book?
So interestingly, on the heels of Matt's conversation, I was born in Russia, which at the time was still the Soviet Union. And just on a side note, one of the reasons we had to leave was because my father was actually being, we were being followed by the KGB, and our phones were tapped, and every once in a while he would get called in to have like these interrogations. So we kind of figured that if we didn't leave, he was going to be going away somewhere else away from us. So we just did everything we could, and we escaped, and we were refugees for a while. So it's kind of an interesting side note that I then ended up washed up in New York City and became an artist and went to art school, and my career is actually in design and IT. I wrote a book about an undercover detective who works in the NYPD, and the reason why I did that is because I married one, and he just had a lot of stories, and the stories were so great. And so I just thought, okay, I'm gonna write about them and make him a girl, and write about what it's like to be a female undercover detective. But I also thought, well, it'd be really interesting if one of the things she was doing was working a racketeering case against the Russian mob. Because although I don't know anybody in the Russian mob, I know a lot about Russians and their culture, and I thought that would be just so much fun to write about. So that's kind of what I wrote about. And my detective, at the beginning of the book, you find out that she's a single parent of this very quirky, newly minted teenage boy. And this teenage boy kind of wants to do all the right things, and no matter what he does, it's just always the wrong thing. And bad things kind of end up happening to him. So that's the book.
Well, we'll come back and talk about him. He's a really interesting character, and I wondered if you had based him on anybody you knew, or if he was somebody that you imagined, but we can come back to that. So Eric, I read your book a long time ago, Eric, because I really love Hawaii, and I have to say I am beyond delighted that Kona Village Resort, which was blown away many years ago, is coming back to life in 2023. And it's a place my husband and I have spent a lot of time on the Big Island. But you're writing, Hilo is over on the East Coast. It's on the rainy side of the Big Island, not the West Coast, the Kona side. What interested you in writing about Hawaii?
Well, I had spent probably 40 years in Hawaii on the Big Island as a vacationer and as laterally a homeowner. My wife happens to have one aunt and one uncle, each of whom went out to Hawaii when they were 20, both married Native Hawaiians, both produced 4 children. So my wife has 8 Native Hawaiian first cousins. And in all the years of going back and forth to Hawaii, we became very good friends with them, particularly the ones who live on the Big Island now. They were originally all from Maui, but now some live on the Big Island. And besides being really wonderful people who are very much into being Native Hawaiians, and who taught me a lot about the language and the culture and so forth, they had the most amazing names. So one of my wife's cousins, for example, is Kualealoa Anelamai Kalani Wang Kaokai. How could you not use that name, in a book? So in all of the Hawaiian names in my book are actually relatives, and not all of them are happy because some of them end up as victims and things like that. But in any event, that's how I got into it. And I wanted to. I've spent a lifetime reading murder mysteries, and I've spent a lifetime reading Hawaiian books as well. There are incredible numbers of great Hawaiian detective books of fiction, but the vast majority are written to be kind of frothy and beach books and kind of lighthearted things for tourists. I wanted to go much deeper into Hawaii, the way Hawaii really is, and darker. And so this one is by no means a normal kind of beach book. It's meant to be a fairly dark novel, but it's definitely a detective murder mystery, and people who stick with it can get to the end, I think, and feel that they, I hope, that they had a good suspense read, but also that Hawaii, became a real factor in the story for them.
Well, it is a police procedural, as you say, not a rom-com or what we call a cozy of the mystery world. And so
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that. But there's some interesting hooks back to, because you are from Seattle, it said.
Yeah.
There's some interesting hooks and in fact scenes in the book that take place in Washington. So
Yeah.
was that something that seemed naturally to arise out of the plot, or was it something you did for a specific reason?
There were some specific reasons, but fundamentally, I'm like you, I've been a lawyer. I've had day jobs my whole career. So I had one book published in 1973, and this is my second book. So all that time in between, I've been working as a lawyer, and where we've had our recreational property includes the Methow Valley of Washington State, which is up in the North Cascades. It's on the dry side of the mountains. If you think the Rocky Mountains of Montana, or if you know Patagonia, the mountains of Patagonia, that's the kind of place that it is. And we've had a little cabin there, an A-frame cabin there, and we had a little place in Hawaii. So it seemed natural for me to take the two places that I knew really well and try to get them into the book. But also, it provided an opportunity to have a mainland hook, as you say, in the whole plot. So. Yeah, it was important to get it in there, and I'm hoping that the people who know the Methow Valley will think that I did as good a job with it as some people who know the Big Island have mentioned to me about the Big Island of Hawaii in the book.
It's an interesting thing. I've spent a lot of time in New Zealand, and while there's a lot of Australian crime, there's not a tremendous amount of New Zealand crime fiction written there and about the Maori. And very little set in Polynesia in terms of crime fiction. So I think I often wonder if Hawaii in many people's mind is sort of classified in that, as Pacific rather than United States.
There are a couple of big difficulties, and I wrote an article about this called the shark infested waters of Hawaiian detective fiction. There are a couple of real things you have to be careful of. One is the vast majority of people in Hawaii speak Pidgin either as a first language or a second language. And it's really risky, especially if you're a haole from the mainland. It's very risky to start trying to write that in dialogue. I'm fortunate that the fellow who reads the audio version of the book actually is a Hawaiian local, and he's able to give the Hawaiian intonation to it, which is great for me to hear. I love listening to it. But I was not going to venture into that area of trying to write Pidgin. And then, of course, you have to be sensitive to things like Hawaiian cultural appropriation, because you're dealing with a native culture that was overthrown by a variety of forces, but including politically by the United States, and which there's still a lot of resentment. And yet you have only 10% of the people in that state who identify as Native Hawaiian these days. So you have a great mix of different types of population there. And I wanted to get one of everyone. I think the best thing that I read about the book in comments was from someone who's a university administrator there, and said, well, you managed to get at least one type of every person who's on the Big Island. So I took that as a compliment, because it's a really diverse population there.
Well, it is a diverse population, but it's an interesting thing that, the crime novel is really more of a white European kind of literary genre when it started. I mean, it's diverse now, and it's now written in original languages in many countries. But so far, with few exceptions, anything written about Native Americans or Polynesians are not written by Native Americans or Polynesians, but rather written by people like you, or read by people like me. And I find the cultural appropriation thing never came into play until all of a sudden we've gotten entangled with more recent politics. I mean, none of the Navajos complained about Tony Hillerman or his daughter Anne. Margaret Cole wrote loads of books about the Arapaho, and nobody ever felt that they weren't authentic because these people were not, the writers were not who they were writing about. So I see your problem.
I did take the precaution of making sure it was thoroughly vetted by the most Native Hawaiians I knew, who were very generous with their time. They corrected a lot of things for me. steered me away from a lot of problems. And to show my appreciation, the royalties, half the royalties are being donated to a Hawaiian language program for scholarship students at University of Hawaii Hilo, which is one of the most impressive programs. It's absolutely astonishing. And by coincidence, there's a big mural on the University of Hawaii Hilo campus called The Bones of Hilo. So I was very happy to see that there's a mural with the same name as the book, but that wasn't why I selected the title for the book.
Excellent. Well, it's an interesting question. I think this whole cultural appropriation issue for writers of fiction is a difficult one. I'm not sympathetic to it because I think it's fiction and you should be able to make it up and talk about whatever you want and imagine whoever you want, but it's kind of difficult at the moment for everyone to do that. So speaking of that, let's go back to Emilya, because I found that Alfie was such an interesting character. And so you could argue in a way the same conversation, Emilya, that, you know, maybe it's appropriation if you don't have, you know, experience in your own life with a child like this. Is he a child on the spectrum? How do you actually envision Alfie?
So I have to say, you're the first person to like point blank ask me that question. And when I was writing it, I was wondering how often I would be asked that. And the answer is I didn't want to kind of diagnose him in the book because, first of all, so to answer your question, yes, I do have experience with people on the autism spectrum. And I know from that experience that diagnoses change over the years, and also people change. In other words, a person or a child who might have been diagnosed with one thing at the age of 6 could be completely different by the time they're 13. So I absolutely did not want to diagnose him or put a pin in it or label him or name him, because the other thing is those names change. You know, you pick up a book from 2000 and a child with developmental disabilities could be called any number of things that are considered absolutely wrong now and was considered totally okay, you know, 20 years ago. So I do have some experience, but interestingly enough, what's inside of Alfie's head, once you get into his head, there's a lot of me in there. So sometimes when people were reading it and they would say, oh, this is a really good example of how a person on the spectrum experiences the world. And I was like, I don't know. That's kind of how I would experience it. So that was an interesting experience for me to have in terms of feedback. So that's
well, I wasn't demanding authenticity of you. I thought you did extremely well. And you know, if he's a character that you mostly imagine, good for you, because you know that, I mean, that comes back to my point. I think that people who write fiction should be able to imagine all kinds of characters.
Inside his head, he's very much imagined. Obviously I have a child, and so I knew that, you know, boys of a certain age are Boy Scouts, you know, often, you know, what, you know, that they're in the marching band. I mean, there's like things that are specific to specific people I know.
Well, let's go and talk about, Matt, give us a short précis, a little pitch, if you will, of your book. Let's do it that way so people know what we're talking about.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I started writing 13 Days to Die in 2012, which is significant because it's about a virus outbreak from China. So as far back as 2012, I'm immersing myself in all of the nuances of virology and all of these terms that now are in our vernacular that we use every day about, you know, T cells and antibodies. You know, that was really important to me to think about how could a virus not disrupt the world from a public health standpoint, but from a geopolitical standpoint. So in the book, there's a virus that breaks out in the Tibetan Autonomous Region of China, which is a very politically unstable part of the country in terms of the activity, the dissidents that the Chinese Communist Party sees as a threat to their legitimacy. So I wanted the outbreak to happen there because I wanted it to kind of rattle the sense of stability within that part of the region. So very quickly it's discovered that patient zero of this outbreak is a Taiwanese intelligence officer. So right then and there, we have the question of, was this an intentional bioweapon delivered through a human intelligence officer from Taiwan as a tactic for destabilizing the Chinese Communist Party? So we immediately get into this conspiratorial thinking of, you know, was patient zero a spy? Was this a nefarious virus? And, you know, ultimately I wanted to think about how could we take the US-China relationship in this mix and bring it to the brink of war. So, you know, could a virus start a war? I mean, this was something I was thinking about long before COVID, long before, you know, any of the pandemic that we're living through now. But again, thinking about how does the virus shape the way the United States, China, Taiwan, Russia, that all of these countries need to interact with one another to ultimately solve this problem before we get to a potential nuclear standoff. You mentioned the title, 13 Days to Die. The book is written in 13 days, that you sort of start at the last day where you're potentially at the climax of this nuclear standoff. And then you kind of go back to day one and march through the 13 days. And that's an homage to the Cuban Missile Crisis because of the same degree of uncertainty that the world faced in the 60s. So it's actually not just 13 days, but it's the same 13 days in October that reflect the Cuban Missile Crisis. Just as kind of an Easter egg, you know, people who study international relations and who are into international affairs, the Cuban Missile Crisis is just such a foundational geopolitical puzzle. So I wanted to kind of pay homage to that with the structure of the book.
Well, it also works well for structure. You have a ticking clock. So, you know, Jeffrey Deaver is really the master of the ticking clock, but it's always good if you can start one and then everything, you know, is propelled by that. But, you know, it also, in a thriller where pace is so important, I think the fact that, you know, you're doing a countdown, whichever direction you happen to be going in, keeps up the level, because thrillers generally don't benefit from periods of calm. Sometimes they're overwritten and the reader's exhausted. I mean, I've read some when I think, you know, I just need a break from all this. You know, it's too much. So I do think it was a really good way to structure the story that you had to tell. So Kris, before we lose you again, are you having trouble with your screen?
I was, but I've put the hotspot on my phone. So let's hope that works better than the in-house
It will,
internet.
and you know, this happens, and it's always good if you just exit and come back, and you know, definitely your phone can save us. So in a way, you have done something similar to Matt, except that your stage is really California and California politics. And so give us a little précis of your book, because I thought that you had an extremely interesting idea here.
Thank you. So I have a young woman who is a government ethics investigator in the capital of California. I'm not sure that position exists, but it probably should. There are government ethics commissions, but in this case, she's actually an investigator, although it does not take place at her work. She's helping her best friend open a preschool. She's taking a day off work to, you know, be nice and help. And instead, all kinds of things go wrong. You're quite right. The beginning of the book, and I think in some ways the jacket blurb is misleading, because the beginning of the book is really meeting a lot of different characters, even though it only takes place in 48 hours. There are several threads and lots of things happen right away. There's a body in the first chapter. There's somebody else dies 2 chapters later. I mean, it's a lot of action, but the core of it, the kidnapping of the 3-year-old girl, really happens 100 pages in. And so then you follow a teenager and a 3-year-old and this investigator trying to find them and help them, again, knowing that she will be safe. To go back to your earlier question about me, yes, there are no pictures of me smiling as a child. It was a very terrifying situation. And in that time, also being older, we were able to walk. At 6 years old, I could walk to the public library. Nobody stopped me or looked for me. And the library was my sanctuary, absolutely. I wanted to read all the books, starting with Z, because that's what I could reach when I was little, the last name Z. And I found adults that were kind. I found adventures where children either saved themselves or were saved by others. And so I still read about 2 or 3 fiction books a week. And what I found is that even though I like thrillers, a lot of times the Violence was too much for me, even though I loved the authors, loved the story. As a person who still wanted that roller coaster of adventure stories that I had as a child, I wanted the same thing. And I will say that in the second one in the series, I have narrowed the number of points of views and kind of tried to stick with Emma, her story, because even though that was fun and interesting, I'm trying something different. But that's what it's about. And the politics are sort of, for me, a backdrop. Having worked in it again for a really long time, I know Republicans and Democrats that I genuinely like. I've seen good people. It's not a this side's thing. There are issues on which I think there are facts, and there are issues on which there is a side that I believe in. But I think for people, my idea was to write a political series where it was not about that kind of fighting. It was about this individual young woman and how she moves through the political setting because she cares about family and people that matter to her. So as you can tell, I enjoyed it. I had never written anything because I was so afraid of my imagination. There were so many real things that were terrifying that I wanted to stay analytical and read other people's books. And then I got an idea for a book that I could not shake. And I thought, I'll just write it for myself. I'm not a creative writer. I write letters to the government. I'm analytical. And then I finished it and I thought, hey, this is pretty good. And then I sent it to a developmental editor who said, this is terrible. So I realized you don't just decide to do it and do it. She said, you only have people seeing things. No one is listening or touching, or, so I had to learn to write fiction over the course of a year. And then I was fortunate, Crooked Lane, as all of you, I love our publisher and I love my agent, Abby Saul. And so now I was so afraid of it, but I just turned 65. I want to write a book a year as long as I'm able to do that. It brings me so much joy, and I was afraid of it. So the reason I want to really emphasize that, anybody who's afraid of dancing or singing or writing because you won't be good, or someone will judge you, or someone will hit you, God forbid, you in your life, you can go beyond that. I really feel blessed. So that's it.
So I failed to ask, Matt, this is your first novel, would that be right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, and for Emilya is your second.
No, it's my first.
No, it is your first. So you made up the case that she worked before, but you didn't actually write about it. In the book, she's coming from a case, and that's one reason that she is living where she is. But you didn't. I couldn't.
No, I did not. No, I did not. No, this is it. This is the beginning.
Okay, so first for you. What about you, Kris?
So this is my first traditionally published, and so it's my debut thriller. 5 years ago, I did a Kickstarter, sort of a fun, again, similar political setting, but a couple hundred books, just a fun trying to understand it. So this is my debut in this world.
Okay, and Eric, you said you'd published something many, many years ago, but do you think of this as kind of your debut?
Well, I was 25 years old and I published a book that turned out, it was nonfiction, turned out to be a complete surprise bestseller. So between that time and this, I've been working. So I've written lots and lots of articles. I've been a contributing editor of Rolling Stone, but I've never had the time to sit down and really write a book. And I've always wanted to write a novel. And this was kind of my COVID novel, I guess you would say. I finally had the chance to get it done. And I don't know how I'm ever going to get another one done, because I'm still working a day job that really interferes with writing. One wishes one could just become a writer, but that's not possible right now.
Or you could be like me and quit and become a bookseller, which I am in almost a year 31. So I've been a bookseller much longer than I was ever.
You have an opening for an assistant? Maybe that would work.
I was actually able to retire because I was quite good in court. So actually our staff, I have to say, strangely enough, COVID has been a business accelerator, such as caught us all so by surprise that my staff are not only have increased, but they're struggling to keep up. We actually passed last year in July, and last year was the best year we'd had in 30 years. So I don't know where this is going, and I don't know whether we can keep up with it, but this is probably our 532nd Zoom event since it all started. Amazing. Sometimes we do 3 a day. It's It's
Well,
not what any of us expected, but I say that just to encourage you all to think about, life now, and especially if we're going backwards somewhat and where you're heading, because it's difficult to imagine what 2022 is going to look like. Very difficult to imagine it. I think in our personal lives and certainly in our business lives, but if you've been writing during COVID, that's good news, right? Because that means you could actually accomplish something and keep going. So I love that.
I do
Why did you?
I do
Sorry.
want to add that I thought I was pretty good in court too, but the difference is that I was always on the defense side. Obviously, if you were able to retire early, you're on the plaintiff side. And I just want everybody else to remember here that, it's the 2% of lawyers who, I mean, the 98% of lawyers who get the other 2% a bad name. And, those.
Well, I will tell you that
lawyers.
I was actually the plaintiff myself.
Oh, yourself.
In a dramatic medical malpractice case, which broke all kinds of legal grounds. So I was the plaintiff.
Oh, I'm going to read about that one.
Now, you'd have to go all the way back to 1982. So it was an interesting time, but this is not about me. So let's talk a little bit about why you decided to write a police procedural. Was that a comfortable thing? Because, it sounds like you could have actually written a legal thriller given your background.
Well, I actually wrote this book twice, and the first time I wrote it, I wasn't able to sell it, even though I had a wonderful agent. And he said he wanted to describe it to booksellers or to publishers as he said what Toby Hillerman had done for the Desert Southwest, the Navajo, Eric Redman has done for Hawaii and the Hawaiians. And I said, oh no, it's not it. And he said, well, what do you think it is? And I said, well, I think it's a combination of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil and The French Lieutenant's Woman. And he said, oh no, that's not it. So to rewrite it, something had to give, and it was mostly The French Lieutenant's Woman part who gave out of this one. So what happened was I had wanted to write a novel that happened to have a murder victim and happened to have a detective, which meant it was going to get in that kind of genre. So in going back to rewrite it, I cut out about 40,000 words and streamlined it more to be a police novel, although I don't think of it myself so much as a procedural. I'm here at my high school reunion with the homicide detective who actually taught me a lot that's in the book. And I asked him, was it okay as far as procedure goes? Because it was more or less made up. And he said, yeah, that was okay. But again, to me, it's still a novel that happens to involve murder and police.
Well, I certainly think that you did a wonderful job with the Hawaiian. And you were very respectful, I think, of Hawaiian culture and Hawaiian myths and so forth. So I think you did a great job. I have edited a series because we used to own part of Poison Pen was we had Poison Pen Press. So I probably edited some 800 books in the course of all that. We sold it to Source Books 2 years ago. So now it's kind of a part of Penguin Random House. But one of my favorite series was set in New Zealand, again, by someone like you and me who went to visit New Zealand and decided it would be wonderful to write about it. And we had the same questions that arose when writing about the Maori. And I was very pleased with how it came out. So we know why Matt wrote his book, and we know why you wrote, well, I guess we know why all of you wrote your books. I thought the interesting one was Emilya, whose husband is actually kind of an engine for this. You said your husband is actually a policeman.
Well, he just retired, but he was a cop, NYPD. He became a detective, and he worked undercover for, I think, 4 years. And so basically, at any given time, he could be seen buying crack somewhere in Manhattan. And I just loved it. He would, there was one day I look out my window and he's on the lawn with a pair of jeans, and he's like running over it with like a hand lawnmower, and he's throwing dirt on it. And I'm like, what are you doing? Because I'm making my costume. I'm like, he loved it. He loved dressing up, and he loved talking about it. And then every once in a while I'd meet some other undercover detective that he'd work with, and they would be the same. They'd be like, oh, that was so exciting, because for them, they would like acting, like completely like acting. They'd come up with a persona, come up with a character, come up with a name, a backstory, like why are they in that neighborhood doing what they're doing, So it was great to listen to them.
Were you ever worried about his safety? I mean, it's kind of a feature of police novels that undercover cops are in constant danger of being exposed or gunned down by, vicious drug gangs or whatever it is that they've infiltrated.
I don't know why, but I never was worried. I always felt like even though he did get into trouble and he did face some pretty dangerous situations and he ended up in the hospital. But I just had a feeling that he would always be okay. Once he left being an undercover and worked in an office, that's when I started getting more worried, because that was sedentary for 16 hours a day and eating really bad food. And I was like, well, that's going to kill him more than getting into a fight with a drug dealer. So I don't know why I thought that, but that's how it felt.
But we didn't really sum up your story, but basically you've got a woman who was an undercover operator in the NYPD, and she's now moved to upstate New York in a quiet community. And one day her son, the Alfie, the one who is socially challenged, disappears. And the question is, of course, what happened to him? Is he alive? Is he dead? And then other things emerge, and you're pretty sure as a savvy crime reader that it has to be something from her past, and her past as an undercover cop that would be causing this, because there's almost nothing in this little bucolic town that she's living in that was likely to have engendered this. So in a way, the backstory that you have to infiltrate here for your character is what drives this plot.
It is, and it what drives it kind of, yeah. there's a lot there, and there's a lot about what being a cop does to you, and it's impossible to go through the job for 20 years without it affecting, and it affects different people differently, but it always affects them. So that's very, very interesting to me.
Let's wind up by talking about your road to publishing, because people are always interested, especially with first-time novelists, how it actually happened to you. So let's see. Well, why don't we just go back up to Matt again? Matt, what was your road to publishing? How many drafts did you write? How many agents did you interview? How many rejections did you get, if any?
So many. So, I took it slow in the beginning because I was starting a new career and a new family, and I kind of wrote on the side. I found it was a cathartic way of transitioning out of the very dark world of spy hunting. And, I got to the point, like others have said, where you have a book and you say, okay, well, this seems like something someone would be interested in. So I started shopping it around. And I, have a fabulous agent. She was one of the first agents that I submitted to, but not after I went ahead and got 99 rejections from other agents, and then followed up. And that's the thing I would recommend to, anybody who's going through this process. I think you got to be thick-skinned and be willing to have rejection, but also just to follow up with people, because a lot of times with the volume that I know these agents receive, they might be interested in your book, but they just didn't get to it. It's in their inbox, and you just drop a kind note and check in, and that's exactly what happened. I just checked in with a few agents I hadn't heard back from, and then immediately was able to set up a phone call and kind of went from there. And then we had some interest in the book, and actually had conversations with Crooked Lane before we hit January 2020 with the outbreaks. So then it was like, okay, how do we release a pandemic book during a pandemic in a way that's tasteful? It was really important to me and my agent as well, that it wasn't exploitative of the situation. Especially in those early days where we really didn't know anything, and the magnitude of the crisis worldwide was still pretty scary and very unknown. So I didn't want this to be, the COVID novel. And in a lot of ways, it's not, again, as I mentioned before, it's not even really a pandemic thriller, because it's not about public health. So there's kind of that extra challenge of, okay, is there going to be more of an audience for a pandemic thriller during a pandemic, because people will just want to sort of disappear into the fictionalized version, or will folks just avoid it because they've got enough of viruses in their life? And I think what we found is, just like with any other genre, there's always an audience. You know, there is a niche for almost any kind of story. And, you know, we found plenty of people who were just so fascinated by what was happening in the world that maybe they hadn't thought about the global impacts of viruses before. And we're kind of diving into this book and some other virus books that came out at the same time that, you know, okay, these were also written years before anything like this happened. So that was kind of my winding road. And then, you know, I'm curious, the others on the session here, how many other books you wrote during that process? Because I know I had maybe 3 other novels that I had going in some stage of completion before this one even really got the traction of getting published. So it's it's interesting to think about it being my first published book, but not necessarily, you know, my first novel or only novel.
Do you envision this as a standalone or the start of a series?
It's definitely going to have one more. You know, the way I left it, I've got some questions that need to be answered. I don't know if it will be more than a 2-book series. I don't think it'll continue beyond that, but it's exciting to see. I mean, we'll see what the characters do. Sometimes I'm not sure until I start writing where they're going to go with it.
Well, a tip for you, since the Tibetan Autonomous Territory and the clash between that and China is so interesting, there's a brilliant series by a lawyer, alert, Elliot Pattison, and the first book in it, called Skull Mantra, won the Edgar the year it was published. And if you have not read these, there are 8 of them, I think, or possibly 9, by Elliot. Start with Skull Mantra and go forward. You may do better to find them as ebooks because they've been out so long, they're probably in a much more expensive paperback format. But I am an enormous fan of them and learned so much. But it really is something you could talk to readers about in terms of explaining your opening scene and this character and why things go that way. It's a wonderful series. So Emilya, what was your road to publishing?
So the book that got published is the 3rd one I queried. The 2 before that just kind of didn't go anywhere. And there were probably at least 2.5 or 3 novels in between that also didn't even get to the querying point. So, but this one just felt right from the very beginning. I wrote it all at once. I didn't super doubt myself while I was writing it. And, you know, the whole thing was kind of like done in a year, which also never happened for me before. And I queried and I got rejections, but I got like maybe 5 or 6 rejections. And I thought, okay, let me back up and let me like get a developmental editor. And I did that. And the editor was like extremely just positive. I think more than anything, what he gave me was a lot of confidence. And he kind of gave me the confidence to keep querying. And then basically the first person I queried after I worked with him is my agent. And I love her. She's the best. I'm going to hold on to her until I have to be pried away from her with my cold, dead hands. You know, she's also incredibly supportive. And I mean, it took a while to sell a book during the pandemic, but somehow that happened, and it actually sold. Like, it sold at a time when I had to. I'm not even sure if the post offices were open officially yet, but I had to it might have been like the first week that you could go to the post office when I had to mail back my contract. So, you know, that's how that went.
Well, perseverance is certainly a key, I think, to getting published. You really have to not be discouraged and persevere. So Eric, what was your path to publishing this book and how different was it from your first book?
Well, the first book, I didn't have an agent, and it was just fortunate circumstances that it ended up getting published. But it had gotten rejected by a lot of publishers, the first one, and yet it became a bestseller. So that was back in 1973. So this time I had the greatest agent in the world when I started out, and it was rejected by lots of publishers. And just at the time that I realized I couldn't do more to it, because we were adopting a 5-year-old girl from China at the time, and I had just finished writing the book on the flight home from Guangzhou to the United States. I knew that with full-time jobs and with the 5-year-old daughter who spoke no English. I wasn't going to get to work on the book for a long time. So I just put it in a virtual drawer and I didn't think about it. It was 126,000 words long. I had a really good friend who worked in publishing who said, oh, you can't have it be more than 85,000 words. And I thought, oh man, I can't revise, 2,000 words a day maximum. When am I ever going to get 60 days, etc. But she kept encouraging me. And finally, I just thought, well, what would happen if I lopped off 40,000 words of it and just basically just did major surgery on it? And then, rewrote it, polished it up and so forth. And I didn't know where to turn for an agent. I wasn't expecting anything fabulous. But I was very fortunate to find a wonderful agent here in Seattle who had very good connections. And she herself had never done any detective fiction. So she was finding her way around among publishers. And when Crooked Lane turned up, we were very, very lucky there to get a new editor. And he grabbed the book, fortunately for me, before he'd finished reading it and got them to give me a contract, which I quickly signed. And then when he finished reading it, I think he was going to tear his hair out because he wasn't nearly as pleased with it by the time he was done reading it all the way through as he had been when he got them to give me a contract. So we had to work on it quite a bit to reconcile our different views about the thing. But I benefited a lot, from the help. I think that I have so many. What came out of the woodwork when I published this was to find out all these authors of Hawaiian detective fiction who have self-published. I didn't know about them, and their books suddenly start flowing into me, and especially when I wrote an article about it. And I think the self-publishing world is a lot better than it used to be. There's no doubt about that. They have some beautiful looking books. I read some of them without even knowing they were self-published. But I think that the rigor of an editor who's really willing to be an editor, someone who's questioning you all the time about why did you do this and why did you do that and why can't it be this way and shouldn't it be that way and you've done too much of that and too little of that. That kind of external judgment from a really good editor, it's painful. And I know authors don't like it. And you hear people self-publish because they don't want somebody to do that. They don't want someone to play with their prose or tell them what's wrong with their prose. But actually, I found it to be enormously beneficial. And it couldn't have been the book that it is without that kind of, if I had self-published it, it would not have been nearly as good a book. And I was just about to do that at the time I found the publisher.
Well, that's certainly one aspect of self-publishing. The harder part, and I'm sure that Kris can speak to this, is that if you self-publish, then you have to do all the work that in a publishing company is done by publicists and marketers and other things. So your job is a lot bigger than just being the author if you want your book to get to readers. So Kris, was that your experience? You said you did self-publish.
I actually used a hybrid. So it was Inkshares. I was their second book. So they did do all that. They did the marketing and everything, but they were brand new as well. The best thing that came out of that first book was I had read John Lasqua's books. You probably all know him in sort of legal crime fiction. I'd read his books for a long time, and they sent it cold to him, my book, and he blurbed it. I'd never met him. And then after that, he became somewhat of a mentor and helped me and read my work. So something really good came out of that. I did not do the traditional path to get to traditional publishing that you all are talking about. I did not query. That could happen to me, I know. I was just fortunate. I've never written those books that are in a drawer because I was working an 80-hour-a-week job as well. I'm a single parent of 3 kids. I didn't write my first book till I was 60. And so I didn't have all that time to experiment and try ideas. I had done, again, so much political and nonfiction, just memos, not books, that I had, and I don't outline, but I do think analytically. And so I was just lucky that the book that I wrote, again, I always use a developmental editor and they helped me a lot, but that the book that I wrote got a lot of interest. And then I got the first agent I wanted, and it got published. That does not mean that's going to be what happens with I have a 2-book deal. So the next book is with Crooked Lane, and I hope the next book will be, and I hope there will be 10 Emmas. That's my goal. I like her. I want to learn how to grow with her. Again, having had 3 children on more or less on my own, got divorced when they were very young, then had 1 out of wedlock just to really be entertained. My main character has no children. And so part of a woman going through life for me, these 10 books would be, what are those adventures? What would that life be like if not from age 20, you were raising kids? So the publishing path has been has been clean, but I don't predict it will stay that way.
It's difficult to know. I forgot to ask. I did ask Matt, but I didn't ask Eric or Emilya or you. Are all of you, I'm assuming, because it's normal for a publisher to do a 2-book contract, because it hardly makes any sense for a publisher to publish a single book. Are all of you under 2-book contracts?
Mine was one, and my agent talked to them about why I wanted to do a series. And that was a big advantage of having an agent and a publisher who listened. And so mine initially would have been 1 in the conversations, and it became 2 before we signed.
Okay, Eric?
No, mine is 1, but I have to give them a right of first refusal if I write another piece of detective fiction.
Well, you have other things to do. So in your case, it probably, would be.
I still hope to write another book of detective fiction. We'll
Right.
see.
Well, I could end up by saying we're going to call Patrick up that from a bookseller standpoint, independent publishing is more difficult just because it's expensive to source books outside the normal system. And it's very difficult for us to put in the time that your publisher puts in order to make things happen. So if you can have a traditional publisher, that's great. If you do publish independently, everybody's right that it's become much more mainstream, much more successful. There are more beautiful books, but you do have to assume a lot of the extra work. And to a great degree, it's a digital market for independent books more than it is a successful print market, just because of the economics that I mentioned. So Patrick, any questions or comments you want to throw in here?
Hello, everybody. There seem to be a shy group on Facebook tonight. We have people tuning in from various different places like Minnesota, Prescott, and all over the place, but nobody seems to be asking any questions.
Well, maybe we covered them with because most of the time readers want to know how you got published. And we could finish with one final one that's always asked. What is it that you've read that you would recommend? So any of you got a book that not your own, but somebody else's book that you'd care to recommend to the audience?
So this is an audio book I listened to. I think it's called Gentleman in Moscow. Is that the right?
Yes, no, it is a print book by
And
Emily
it is a print book as well. And I love that book. I just was so entertained, and it has a pandemic quality because there's a closed, I won't give anything away other than to say that it's someone who can't leave a hotel for a long period of time, and it's in Moscow. So it's just a fabulous cast of characters and writing, and the narrator is wonderful. But the print, I should order the print book from you. I will do that because I'd like to have the print book here and be able to look at some of the passages and so on, which you can't get with an audiobook. It's a fabulous
book. Thank you. She's talking about A Gentleman in Moscow, and the author's name is Towles, Towles, Amor, Amor is his first name. Eric, do you have a book that you recommend?
Well, interestingly enough, as a result of writing this one, The Bones of Hilo, someone told me you really need to read Honor Killing. Honor Killing is a nonfiction book by a guy named Ray Stannard. It was published in 1995, and it is a history of the Massey rape and murder trial in 1931 and 32 in Honolulu. And I thought, oh, I know all about that trial. I don't have to read this. It's one of the most important books I've ever read. It's a gripping story. There's lots of interesting detail, including that Clarence Darrow was the defense lawyer, his last case. It also true that at that time in Hawaii, rape was a capital crime, so you'd be executed for it. The Navy was trying to take it over and execute the accused men in this rape. But it's also, in one volume, you get the entire history and the things that flowed together to create modern Hawaii that really began with those events of that trial. So for me, it's just a plain good book, period. But if you want to really understand Hawaii, it's excellent, called Honor Killing.
Excellent. How about you, Emilya?
So right now I'm reading Quentin Tarantino's novelization of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and I love it so much. It is not in a straight sense really a novel or anything resembling a novel, or written in any way resembling how a novelist would write a novel, but it's like pure Tarantino, and it is priceless for just cadence and words and how he just puts it all together. And it's like he breaks every single rule of writing we've all learned. He just doesn't care, and it works. But I also want to talk about a book I just finished reading a couple of weeks ago, and it's called Bathhouse by P.J. Vernon. And I loved it, and it's a thriller. It's kind of like a psychological, I guess you could call it a domestic suspense crossed with psychological thriller. I don't know. But what I love about it is that he kind of did something that a lot of thriller writers are told not to do, which is he just wrote a lot about obsession, about people being very obsessed with each other. And I love that. I think there should be more of that.
It's an interesting book. When she says bathhouse, it's H-A-U-S. It's not the traditional spelling. So if you're looking for it, don't be surprised. All right, Matt, you get to wind up. What would you recommend?
Yeah, so I'm a huge Stephen King fan, and I read them out of order. Someday I'll read all 60, however many books there are, but I recently finished kind of an older one called Under the Dome, and it's one of those 1,000-page bricks. I always read physical books, so I'm carrying around these giant books all the time that he's written. And I love that one because the cast of that book is so enormous. It's the entire town that is trapped under this dome that has fallen over this, small Maine town. And you think, well, it's impossible that you're going to get to know everybody from, the shop owners and the mechanics and the teachers and the police officers, but you do, and you really feel like you're part of this town. And then within the span of, I don't know, less than a week, the entire thing becomes an autocracy. And so just seeing how human nature in that situation devolves into such a disaster when you cut it off from the rest of the world. The interpersonal relationships that he's able to develop. I think a lot of people maybe who don't read King just think, oh, he's a horror writer, everything's going to be gory or terrifying, but I think there's so much more to what he's able to spin in his stories that goes way beyond just being afraid of things.
He's a very protean writer. You can't say that about everybody, but he definitely is prolific in protein. He also has written a brilliant book on writing. Patrick, is that the title of it? Is it called On Writing? I think it might be.
That's it. Yeah, that's it.
For anybody who's watching this who's an aspiring writer, you could hardly do better than to read Stephen King's book on writing. Well, this has been a real pleasure to get to meet all of you. So thank you for joining us. Congratulations on being published. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Thank you all for who watched us. And if you've enjoyed this, recommend it to your friends because it will stay up on our Facebook video page, and there'll be a podcast as well. So have a great weekend, everybody. Good night.
Thank you so much for having us. Nice to see you all.